Hi, my name is Mary Beth Arbogast, and I will be sharing my review of the book Peace Child by Don Richardson. It was a book I had never heard of before, just picked from the class list, and it was an incredible book. I could not put it down. Not only was it just a great missionary biography, or autobiography in this case, but also it was just fascinating to learn about the culture of the people that Richardson and his wife Carol went to minister to, called the Sawi people in Netherlands, New Guinea. A tribe or villages full of headhunters and cannibals who had no access to the modern world, to modern medicine, to just any type of way of life that I'm familiar with. And then also, it provided a really great example of real life contextualization of the gospel, which is one of our discussions from a couple weeks ago. The way that Don Richardson presents the way that he presented the gospel to this people who's totally different from himself and everything that he had known. He shows of how God, in his providence, placed these redemptive analogies within the Sawi culture that had been there for generations upon generations upon generations, for one day messengers to come to utilize those analogies to share the gospel with the Sawi. And so he states his thesis pretty clearly, actually in the epilogue, which is, redemptive analogies, God's keys to man's cultures, are the New Testament-approved approach to cross-cultural evangelism. And he proves this very clearly. He says, the Sawi were strangers to our Judeo-Christian heritage. Richardson includes a prayer, and this is one of the quotes that I think is really powerful and kind of captures the essence behind the book. The Sawi were strangers to our Judeo-Christian heritage, yet you so providentially ordained these redemptive analogies within their cultures ages ago, so that one day we would find and use them for your glory. You were concerned not only for the messengers, but also to prepare a culture to receive their message. And in that, not only is he stating just how we can go about doing contextualization and communicating between cultures, but that God providentially places analogies and bridges for us to use to communicate the gospel to people in all cultures. And since God has promised that people will be saved from all nations, all tribes, and tongues, we can be confident that no matter what culture we go into, that God has placed those analogies there for us to utilize. So it instills a lot of hope and a lot of confidence in God and his work in amongst the nations. And so two of the clearest examples of this from the book is the example of the Tarap Tim, which is translated the Peace Child. So there's a situation that's going on. The Richardsons have moved to this one location, and because the Tuans, as the Sawis call them, white people, have moved into their area, the Tuans can provide steel axes, modern medicine, modern devices that the Sawi don't have access to, but they want access to. So therefore, you have different Sawi villages, different people from Sawi's villages, relocating to move closer to the Tuans, to Dan and Carol Richardson and their family. And so the whole time, the Richardsons are learning the language, learning the customs, and finally, Don Richardson comes to the point where he's able to connect with the Sawi. He at first thinks that the only thing that they have in common as far as their belief, their worldview, is that the Sawi believe in the supernatural and he believes in the supernatural, and that it affects the supernatural world affects your day-to-day life. And he thinks at first this is the only bridge. And so he does his best trying to communicate the idea of God, the greatest spirit, the most powerful spirit, to these people, and tries to share the gospel with them, but they are bored by it. And then at one point he even comes to sharing the gospel and mentioning the story of Judas and how he betrayed Jesus. And they're ecstatic, and they find Judas as their hero. I believe Dr. Morello referenced that in one of his lectures. And it's just so foreign to us who, especially somebody like me who's grown up in the church, who has known Judas to be a synonymous term with traitor for, like Benedict Arnold, as I've grown up in America, it's a synonymous term with traitor. But the Sawi, because they valued treachery, they had a concept in their culture called Tuwai Asanaiman. I'm probably saying that wrong. But it means essentially to fatten a friend, fatten someone with friendship for slaughter. So they would intentionally go above and beyond to show kindness and generosity and friendship towards a certain person to get them to the point to where they could betray them and kill them and then eat them. And this was like the highest ideal within their culture. So whenever that's their highest ideal, whenever that's their highest goal in life, it does bring you to the point of how do you share the gospel with people like this? When on the front hand of things, it only seems that the only thing that you have in common in your worldview is that there's a supernatural world and it interacts with your day-to-day life. However, as the Tuans are living amongst these 3 Sawi villages, as you can imagine, these people who value treachery, there's constant fighting. Fighting within the villages themselves, fighting all 3 of the villages together. And the Richardsons are trying their best to instill peace, to encourage them to find peace with one another, but it's impossible. So Richardson concludes. And he finally tells the group that they're going to just move up the river to another Sawi village, just in that one village, so that way everybody can go back to their business beforehand. Because Richardson becomes concerned that if they continue to fight, that they're going to kill each other, not having repented of their sins, but also that there's such a low life expectancy and there's so much rampant disease that the people are going to die out eventually. So he wants them to just go back to their own way of life. He'll come to them. However, the Sawi, they don't want the Tuans to leave. So they tell him one day that they are going to sprinkle cool water on each other. And this means that they're going to make peace. Now, Richardson is, as you can imagine, very skeptical of how and if they are actually going to make peace and if it's actually going to last. So he describes how he was watching a situation where it was clear that a mother was in deep distress and despair because a child was being taken away from her. And so one villager, his name was Kaio, who was from the Khmer village, he took his only son, gave it to a Hainam villager named Mahor. So Kaio took his son to the Hainam villager, gave him his son, and then Mahor took Kaio's name. So Mahor would now be known as Kaio. And then another villager from the Hainam brought his son to Kaio to give to him, and then Kaio took on this other villager's name. And the whole villages came around these 2 children, laid their hands on them, and signified that they were all agreeing to enter into this peace treaty. Now, Richardson had a lot of questions, because obviously this is a very confusing cultural tradition to somebody on the outside, and they explained that as long as these children, these boys, lived, that there would be peace among the villages, and that the 2 men who gave up their children, that they were they were given the authority to enact the Peace Child Treaty. So if they saw somebody stirring up conflict amongst the villagers, they could grab them by the earlobes and tell them to remember the Peace Child. And this was supposed to disperse any kind of conflict. So, to our Christian ears, it's obvious that that is a connection to the gospel, and especially the one man who gave his only son to create peace. So Richardson is just floored by this practice, and it opens up the door for him to share the gospel and to press them to say that God has provided this perfect peace child who never dies, and so that peace is always established, perfect peace. And he shares the passage in Isaiah that says, "Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end." And I think that the Sawi people understand that verse in a way that we do not. The Prince of Peace, because we don't have to worry about walking out our door and people shooting us with bow and arrows or spears because they are wanting to kill us and to eat us. Generally, people have a lot of trust one another. And so the fact that they can understand the peace child in a lot more tangible, significant ways just shows the beauty of communicating the gospel to another culture. And then, a very grotesque practice, even a practice that the Sawi people find very gross, is witnessed by Richardson and provides an even more beautiful analogy for the gospel to be communicated. So 9 days after someone dies, because they lived next to a river, there was a lot of flooding, so they would build these grave houses elevated above the ground. And 9 days after the person died, the first stage of it is there would be men who would go up into the grave house around this rotting corpse, breathing in the smell, which was putrid, as we can imagine. So that was the first stage. The second stage is that someone would dance under the grave house, and the rest of the people would shake it so that parts of the body and maggots would fall onto the person that was dancing. So that would be the second stage. Then the third stage is men would go into the grave house, and then one lucky man would have the honor of punching the chest cavity of the dead person, bringing their hand out, which you can imagine probably covered, smelling even more terrible, probably wishing your hand could have just gotten cut off as you pulled it out. And this man must go into the community house and eat food with this contaminated hand. And afterward, after this process, Richardson heard a woman singing a song referring to the words of Riemann. And so he asked, "What is Riemann?" And basically it's the concept of like a caterpillar transforming into a moth. It doesn't die, but it continues to live on. So Riemann equals regeneration to them. Very Christian term, very helpful to know for someone like Richardson. Then he asks about the story behind the words of Riemann. What are those words? So they tell him this story involving a lizard and a snake and a bird, but essentially they believed at one point in time that human beings, specifically the Sawi, had control over whether or not they died, so they could have the power to regenerate themselves so that they wouldn't die, but because the lizard listened to the bird and not the snake, they didn't have that power anymore. But one day, they would hear the words of Riemann, and they would have the power to regenerate, so that way death would not exist anymore. And there you see the beauty of another analogy that is embedded within the Sawi culture that was just waiting to be harvested for the gospel. And so, because of these two analogies that Richardson saw within their culture, the gospel spreads like wildfire. And the book ends in a beautiful way of describing many, many different Sawi villagers coming together on Christmas Day to worship, and them actually making peace and not being afraid to be in the same vicinity as one another. So overall, it was an incredible book. I highly recommend that you read it for your own sanctification and enjoyment, but also just it's a clear picture of contextualization and communicating the gospel faithfully and clearly in the context of a foreign culture. Possibly the only drawback I could think of, if I had to pick one, is that just because it's a foreign culture, the words are very different than ours, and also there's quite a complex network of villages and then the villagers within those villages. So it gets a little tricky to keep up with, and I actually had to make myself a chart so that I could keep up with everybody. You can see all my color coding, and even that didn't do it perfectly. But overall, it was a great book. I highly recommend it, and I hope that you read it yourselves and that you enjoy it as well. So, thanks. Bye.